Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming and attending to our session. My name is John Miller. I'm one of the product managers here at Jamf Software. Here, I think one of the great excitements coming out of the Apple ecosystem, and kind of one of the things that we wanted to talk about in version 9.5 of the Casper suite and later is iBeacon technology. And so myself and Brad Benson are here to talk about iBeacon, kind of see some of the pros and cons and that sort of thing, where it's applicable. And really our goal is to kind of spark some imagination for where using things like iBeacons is applicable and what some of the cool and exciting things you can do with iBeacons are. So like I mentioned, my name is John Miller. I'm one of the product managers here at Jamf Software.
And I'm Brad Benson. I'm a software architect and engineering manager here at Jamf Software.
Yeah, and so we just want to spend some time. Brad's going to kind of go over generally what iBeacons are, and there's been a lot of great sessions and a lot of great conversations and Jamf Nation posts, just different things talking about iBeacons. So Brad will kind of give a little bit more context and color around that, and then afterwards I'll talk a little bit about defining iBeacons in the JSS, how to actually go through the definition and see some of that in action, and then what that actually means in different ways we can do that. So,
yeah. So we talked through the agenda a little bit. I'm going to explain a little bit about iBeacons. I assume that most folks have heard of iBeacons. I'm not going to make the assumption that everybody's an expert in it. I'm not yet. And then we'll talk more about what iBeacons can do and how you can leverage that with the Casper suite. So the first thing I'm going to do is explain a little bit about iBeacons. First thing actually I'm going to start with a story. So a long time ago, when I was about 5 years old, I was out playing in the yard, and my parents called me to come in. My folks said that my grandma wanted to talk to me, and she sat me down on her knee, and she said, "Brad, I want you to remember there's some important things that you need to think about when you're deploying iBeacons." And so with that, I'm going to give you the too long didn't read story first. This is near. This is far. So in closing, I'd like to ask if there's, So let's talk a little bit about iBeacons, the technology in general. Probably the key thing to remember about iBeacons is that it's a proximity technology, not necessarily a location technology. What do I mean by that? Well, it means that the iBeacon doesn't necessarily know where it is, but it can tell you if something's close to it or not. I want to talk a little bit about privacy. Privacy is a big concern in today's age. Who is concerned about privacy, right? It's all over in the news. And we want to make sure that we understand how iBeacons interact with privacy. Last, I want to talk about some considerations that you need to keep in mind when rolling out the technology. So let's talk a little bit more about proximity first. Merriam-Webster defines proximity as a nearness in space-time relationship. We're mostly interested in the relationship of space as it pertains to physical distance. So with proximity, this is key. Actual location is not provided by an iBeacon. You don't get latitude, you don't get longitude, you don't get addresses, you don't get any of that. Instead, you get a relative distance based on signal strength coming out of the iBeacon. What do I mean by that? Well, iBeacon uses Bluetooth technology, and we'll talk a little more about that in a bit, but it does that, it determines proximity based on that Bluetooth signal strength. Why is that important? Well, because among other things, it's not going to give you things like motion. It's not going to give you things like bearing and distance. It's not, those kinds of things that we've come to know and expect from mapping applications that take advantage of location services. It doesn't really apply to iBeacons because iBeacons, again, is a proximity-based technology. So let's talk a little bit about proximity more in depth and how iBeacons works in that. There's really kind of three types of proximity that iBeacons will help you detect. First, there's immediate. Think of this as being like right next to something, just a few centimeters away. So hypothetically, if there was, I don't know, a payment system that used a mobile device and some kind of, I don't know, payment terminal and you needed to put your phone near it, that might use an iBeacon sort of technology to determine that something was in immediate proximity, that is a few centimeters. Next, there's near. This is a few meters away. So what might something that uses this look like? Well, for example, let's say that you are standing near an ATM, right? You're not holding your phone this far away from it, you're just standing there. You're, maybe a meter or so away. Or you're standing near a printer and you want to understand what's going on with that printer, and iBeacons can help you select the right printer within your system. Lastly, there's far. Far is more than a couple of meters, typically greater than 10 meters, out to the limits of what iBeacon's technology can detect. Where would you use this? This might be useful for knowing that you're in a certain room at a venue, at a conference, and you're curious as to what the topic is, for example. That's really how iBeacons treats proximity. It's not going to give you exact distance measurements. It's going to give you a rough ballpark. And based on that, you can do several different things, and we'll talk more about some use cases, how you can leverage that in the JSS in a bit. So let's talk about privacy. I want to emphasize that iBeacons aren't a tracking device. You can't slap one on the side of somebody's car and then track them across town. I slapped a $50 iBeacon on John's car, I'm out a $50 iBeacon because I can't track him.
I can't get it off my car.
It's not tied to a specific mobile device. So that is to say that an iBeacon that is detected by an iPhone or iPad has no knowledge that it has been detected by that iPhone or iPad. It doesn't store a list of everything that's come by it. It can't be used as some sort of monitoring system in and of itself. It doesn't track anything really, it just broadcasts things. It's not unlike, say, a lighthouse that's just flashing something, right? There needs to be an external entity that makes use of that information. Really, when you get down to it, once you get past all the technical details, iBeacons just broadcast 3 values, really. And it's up to some other application to make use of those values. That other application can do evil, or in the case of the JSS, it can do good, right? And those values being used as tokens can let you do things like inventory. They can let you do things like making users' lives easier by showing them configuration profiles based on which room they're in, or things like that. So I've mentioned a couple times now that it's based on Bluetooth technology, and I'm going to ask, how many people are pretty familiar with Bluetooth, right? It's a pretty common thing. You see it with all kinds of peripherals. If you've been tagged and you got the thing in your ear walking around, that's using Bluetooth. Bluetooth is an awesome technology, but it's got some shortcomings or limitations, really, that were enforced upon it because of the underlying radio technology it uses. What do I mean by that? Well, it uses the unlicensed 2.4 gigahertz band. So my Bluetooth headset at home stops working if I'm downstairs and my wife turns on the microwave. Why is that? Because microwaves operate on the same band. If my kids with their little remote control helicopter happen to fly that near my computer when I'm working, my Bluetooth headset stops working. That's also on the unlicensed 2.4 gigahertz band. Those kind of things can interrupt Bluetooth just as they can interrupt Wi-Fi. Speaking of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth has less range than Wi-Fi, therefore iBeacons have less range than Wi-Fi. Optimistically, you can think about 70 meters, but that's line of sight, and that's impeded by the structures that go around it. In a wide open space, it's probably reasonable to expect 70 meters, give or take. But if you're in an enclosed space, it can be reduced, sometimes drastically. Originally, I went to school for electrical engineering, so I'm going to pull out an electrical engineering term. Who here knows what a Faraday cage is? Oh, wow, okay, cool. So now that we're all electrical engineers, if you think about how a plaster building is built, or plaster walls that's got the screen behind and the stuff over it, that's a Faraday cage. Your Bluetooth is not going to work very well going through the walls. Things get a little bit better with brick or steel construction. They're best with wood. But the key thing is that range is impeded by the structure. So if you have an open layout building, for example, a room like this wouldn't need as many iBeacons to provide total coverage as would a more closed structure like this. How many iBeacons would a closed structure need? Well, that's really something that is discovered during the rollout phase, during trial and error and planning. There is no single answer because there's no single building. So I want to talk a little bit about power considerations. One of the things that bites people when they roll out Bluetooth-based iBeacons, when they roll out iBeacons, they deploy 100 of them, and they work awesome for about a year because they went with the easiest rollout possible, a battery-based iBeacon. What happens when those batteries start dying? Well, the iBeacon stops working. Which one dies first? That's the surprise. How many beacons did you roll out? 100? Well, you get to have an exciting life for a few months as all those beacons expire their batteries, as they use up their batteries. Power is a very important thing, and especially low-end iBeacons are awesome for testing, but they don't have the same kind of power monitoring capabilities that more advanced ones will have. So that's something to be aware of as you roll out iBeacons in your organization. Another thing to keep aware of is how many iBeacons can a mobile device detect? So within iOS, the iBeacon technology is implemented by location services, regions as they're called. And iOS has a limitation of 20 regions per application. This is done for power management, primarily, I believe. But the net result is if you have 40 iBeacons you want to monitor, 40 different iBeacons representing, say, 40 different rooms, you're only going to be able to monitor 20 of those at any given time, and moreover, the order isn't necessarily defined. On OS 10, there's more than that. You'll notice I didn't put a specific number there. Why is that? Well, that's because there's not a specific number on OS 10. Rather, the limit is going to be determined based on performance and power usage and things like that. And it will likely vary from system to system. In our labs, we've tested several hundred iBeacons on a single Mac. So that kind of gives you an idea of maybe an order of magnitude more. But again, that is going to be dependent on your environment. Perhaps the single most important consideration for using an iBeacon with the JSS is the mobile device that is tracking or looking for iBeacons needs to be in communication with the JSS, right? It's kind of a philosophical question, actually. If an iBeacon is detected and there's no JSS to hear it, did it make a sound? Right? The way the iBeacon detection interacts with the JSS requires that the JSS knows about it, and therefore means that the device needs to know about it. What's a scenario that could happen if this idea isn't kept at the forefront of your mind as you're planning your iBeacon rollout? Well, let's say, for example, that you have a device and you want to make sure that it's always hearing an iBeacon because you don't want to lose control of that institutional device. You want to know when it leaves your campus. So you've got this, Wi-Fi iPad, for example, that's listening to beacons, and it's finding all these beacons as, it's being carried around your facility or your campus, and life is good. It goes outside the front gate, right? Drives away. Oh, I don't see iBeacons anymore. I better tell the JSS. But this is a Wi-Fi only iPad. It has no way to tell the JSS that it has left the building. And so as a result, the JSS has no way of knowing that that device has left the building. That would be an example of a bad idea, bad rollout for iBeacons. So with that, John Miller is going to tell us a little bit more about how to use and how to leverage iBeacon technology within the Casper suite. John.
So this kind of good information to know as far as how iBeacons function as a whole, but then really it gets down to, well, why do we care? What's the point of it? What are we going to do with it? And what are some of the things that, the use cases, the application to iBeacons in our environment? I think the most obvious one that everyone knows about is that Apple loves iBeacons and they're using it for retail. And iBeacon is a big retail thing, but maybe not all of us are retail environments or we have different places. And so the technology is brought into the Casper suite to use that idea of proximity, where right now I may be far from Brad, but if I step onto the new carpet, then I'm near, and that might trigger a different set of actions. That might actually make me as a user providing different tools based on what I need. It gives us that idea of context for here's what I'm going to do, and now that I know that that device is near that space, near that region, that might dictate some different things. And so what we're hoping to do is walk through just the definition of how to put iBeacons in the JSS, and then give some ideas of different things that you can do with it now that you have that context and that proximity. Has anybody actually defined beacons and are using iBeacons in their JSS and doing different things? A few people here and there. Cool. I hope at the end of this what we can do is actually start posting to Jamf Nation to say, this is what we're doing, here's some ideas we have, here are ways that we're doing it, and really kind of expand that technology into new places outside of retail and start showing the value. So the first thing that we actually want to do is talk about how to define them within the JSS themselves and actually make a few points. So I'm hopefully not too tall here where you guys can see, but I'll move to the side. In the JSS, if you go to your settings, under the network for the general settings, the network organization, you can kind of see blurred out a little bit, there's iBeacons. And you can define your iBeacons, and each one has those three values that Brad mentioned. It's the UUID, the major, and the minor. And what's important to know about that is first, you have to define those for the beacons themselves. And there's some great tools we've heard about this week for how to make those values. When you procure new beacons, you have to set them up a little bit, and so there's some setup tools that are available that help kind of get that. But once you have that, define those in the JSS so that the JSS knows these are the beacons I care about, and more importantly, these are the regions that I care about. And so if a beacon comes through and we have some of this information, we know to actually do something with that. So here in the JSS, you see the name column. In the middle is the UUID, and then there's the major and the minor numbers. The important thing to think about when defining your iBeacons and kind of planning your rollout is that those aren't necessarily hard, fast numbers that adhere to something. iBeacons are, at least for me, were first thought of very similar to a network segment, where I can say, well, anything that's in 10.10.1.1 to 10.10.1.255, that's this specific area of our network because we know that devices that connect up to these switches get that stuff, right? iBeacons are similar, but it's kind of like a LAN versus WAN type idea where 10.10.1.1 to 10.10.1.255 could exist in a bunch of different places. And we can define that. And so within the JSS, there's a bit of a layer of abstraction where the beacon regions or the beacons themselves can be defined as any individual little puck, whatever we have that, or multiples. That could be a region. It's not necessarily just one thing that has a unique identifier. It could be multiples that are all together and denote this coverage area defined by these three values equals the Eau Claire office, equals the Guthrie Theater, equals a classroom in your environment, equals a whole floor of classrooms. It can be any number of those kind of things. And so that's kind of the first hurdle, at least for me, to get over, to say, okay, this is actually not like a network segment. This can be a bunch of different things, and I could define it in a few different ways. So once we define those regions, we can have as many as we want, have those in the JSS, and actually do some reporting on that to say, okay, we have all of our regions. Then we can actually start doing something with that. So if you're looking to start working with iBeacons, I'd say get some iBeacons, get them configured, and do some planning much like you would network planning with a wireless infrastructure upgrade or something like that to say, here's the coverage that we want, here's where these APs are going to go, but it's actually going to be these little beacon pucks, right? Or whatever the thing that's the signal is going to be submitting from. Plan those things out and have those regions. Me, I'm a graphical person. I can see things and learn better, so maybe even put it on a map and have that up as you're planning it out to say, okay, these things should cover about this specific area. Then when you put it in the JSS, it's not as confusing to be looking at the numbers at least and thinking, well, what does that mean and that sort of thing. As much as iBeacons themselves are not necessarily tied to a region in space naturally, they can be in our definition. So it's a little hard to see in the text here, but what I have is those are defined as kind of 3 separate areas. One is the Eau Claire office. I'm from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, so kind of root for the home team. So Eau Claire office is there. The next one is Eau Claire 4th floor. That's the floor of the building that my desk is in, and so that can be another region that we have. And then the last one is Eau Claire Bear Den, which is one of our offices in Eau Claire, and we can have some broad definition that's represented to a point in space so that we know, okay, well, this one's near Eau Claire. When I'm in the Eau Claire Bear Den, I know that I get this, or if I leave that space, I know that that might happen. And so kind of defining it to that physical place in space and time might be helpful for the things that you have and having that be a part of that name definition. Once we have that, once we have all our definitions, the other thing I was thinking about, sorry, I forgot about this part, but if you have that physical space and kind of mapped out, if you're a graphical person like me, you can use the API to submit all your beacons as well. So you can define your beacons, have your lists, and then put that through to the JSS using the script. So all this stuff can be made public afterwards, so if you wanted to see what that curl command explicitly is, and my password is not JNUC, that was example's sake. So that's a joke. You can laugh if you'd like. So first thing that we want to do is actually look at the different stuff that we can do with the JSS, and one of those is reporting and actually just knowing what devices in my environment are capable of using the technology that we have, right? Who in my environment is actually capable of using iBeacons? And most of that comes down to hardware. What hardware is there, and is everything kind of set up ready? And would it be able to use the triggers that we have? There's a Jamf Nation article that shows what the criteria are specifically for mobile devices and your OS X devices, but it's important to note that it's just helpful to have a view of here are all the devices that are Bluetooth capable and are able to actually utilize the Bluetooth and the iBeacon technology. So kind of getting an idea for who's actually capable, where are some of the gaps that I have. When you're doing some of your device planning year over year, you'll know, well, when we purchase new hardware, right now we've got 75% of our users that are covered with this technology. We've got this other 25% that are on this long of a refresh cycle, so that school building, they're not going to be able to use this until later, so we don't have to plan the space for beacons until later. Kind of helps doing the planning for the rollout with what you have. The first example that we want to give, and we're just going to go over 3 different examples, and the first is one that I'm kind of particularly interested in. I think it's just exciting and kind of cool. We've talked about, and Apple has made great steps forward with respect to AirPlay, right? With iOS 7, we could actually define specific AirPlay targets. The JSS can manage our Apple TVs for us and give us the ability to not only keep that inventory, but deploy the ability to AirPlay to the specific devices. One of the problems that we had with that is if, for example, Sandy is in my class and she's also in another class at a different time and another class at a different time, I might not know where she is, and so I'd have to give all those targets. So every time that student or every time that end user would try to AirPlay, they would get the passwords and the targets for all of them that they have if they're within that subnet or can see it over the network. Well, with iBeacons, we can actually make that automatic to only be a single target. If a device falls into a region, we could say, okay, now this device is in the Bear Den, and so maybe that user is now, past that mark. Maybe they want to actually AirPlay to that. And so the JSS is just going to automatically deploy the AirPlay target and the passcode to that device. So when they open up and say, I want to AirPlay my Mac or I want to AirPlay my iOS device, the only thing they'll see is the Bear Den. And then if they leave that region, it's going to say, hey, I'm no longer in that anymore. And then the JSS is going to say, okay, well, we'll remove that restriction of AirPlay targets, and so now you can see everything, or now, maybe you don't see any. And so whatever that definition may be for your environment, just that ability to say, when I go into a conference room and I want to share my screen, everything's going to be there for me, and we don't have to do any of the kind of fuddling around with, does this user have the passcode? Oh, they don't have the target. We have an Apple TV in just about every conference room in our office, so when I try to go to the target, there's something like 45 different Apple TVs across the 2 offices that we can see. And so this makes it a lot easier. It's just the one, everything's there, I can AirPlay, and we're back up and running. So kind of some fit and finish, little polish that me as an end user, I really appreciate as a capability to happen. And it's just there, and everything happens for me. Another one that we have, this one I've called Printer 2.0. We've talked about the ability in self-service to make it easy to not only deploy printers, but set defaults and that sort of thing using self-service. So I go into an office, I launch self-service, I authenticate if I need to, and just the Eau Claire printers or just the Cupertino printers are there for me. iBeacon makes that very simple as well, and kind of the next iteration of that same thing. You can use that same idea, but again, Bluetooth technology working on the Mac, we know that we can use iBeacons for that. And so anytime I go into an office, anybody that's near this specific printer in this office, anybody that's near, within that whole region of Eau Claire, they're going to get all of them. They're going to get just the one on the 3rd floor. I've been working in the Minneapolis office and the Eau Claire office on and off for the last 5 years, and every time I go to the Minneapolis office, I think, which one's west and which one's north? Just confusing for me. We have those two printers. So with iBeacon, we can say, well, you're near this one. This is the one you have. This is the only printer that's going to show up, or it's just the default. So all I have to do is the shortcut command to print, and it's printing at the printer that's nearest me. Just very nice. Again, fit and finish, some polish, some really nice stuff that iBeacons can allow us as admins to make available for our users. The last one that we want to talk about is off-campus, and this is really for VPN users. So any corporate world where we have VPN, you're on campus, you don't need the VPN, but you're off campus and you might need that and have that as an availability. Whether this is for users who are traveling all the time, like the sales team or anything like that, or if you just have remote employees that are VPNing in all the time, from an InfoSec standpoint, maybe we don't need to deploy that VPN profile to every single user. Maybe everyone that's just a standard user that's going to be in the office and not traveling as much, they won't need that profile. Well, with iBeacon, we can make that very simple for both platforms. Again, an idea where anytime a user leaves the campus, that would get triggered back to the JSS, assuming they can talk and it's got everything there. Or the next time it comes back on, it will tell the JSS, hey, I'm off campus now. And the JSS would say, okay, cool, here's the VPN profile, so if you ever need to get onto our network, you've got that VPN and everything's there. If that's a helpful thing, VPN can be everything from just the config profile to actually deploying that package if it's the first time so that they have that. If you're leveraging DEP, they go through, do the enrollment that sees that it's automatically off campus because it's not near that region and gets deployed. And so you can kind of provide some of those tools for anyone that's not contextually near the things that you have for the different reasons that you may need to, and make that very simple for the end users. There's all kinds of different ideas and things that we're looking at for where iBeacons can make it simple for us. Another one that we talked about that I didn't put in here is if I'm an end user and I actually, now with Yosemite being able to deploy books and the idea of managed ebooks and automatically deploying, I go to a conference room, we're going to be looking at some spreadsheets and graphs and things. I sit down, that automatically gets deployed to my iPad. I see it in iBooks, I can use it, view it, see what I need to. It's a managed ebook, so I can't save that off to a personal box or anything like that. As soon as I leave that conference room, the command is sent to no longer provide access to that ebook, and it's gone off my device. And so some of that idea of InfoSec and deploying this stuff contextually to the people that need it, when they need it, is also very exciting about iBeacon, rather. So those are the examples we have. We're really excited about the other stuff that you guys are going to come up with too, and different ideas that you have. We've got time for Q&A. We've kind of purposefully kept this a little bit short, making sure that if there's other questions that people may have about iBeacon, we can actually talk through that stuff, kind of bring up different ideas and that sort of thing. So Josh has got a microphone. We got one on the left there.
It's kind of a stupid question.
Yeah.
Do your mobile devices have to be managed by Casper to sort of take advantage of all this?
Yeah, so the question is, do mobile devices have to be managed by the JSS to take advantage? So iBeacon is available for all kinds of things, not just the management capabilities. If we do want to take advantage of that automation and the management capabilities, yes, they'd have to be managed by the Casper Suite.
I'd add to that, one of the cool things is that it's not just the Casper Suite. So if you have an iBeacon that's used by the JSS, it can also be used for other applications. Concurrently. It's not like if you have 5 applications that want to take advantage of iBeacons, you don't need 5 different iBeacons in that same space.
Sorry, up here. Anyways, if we have Macs that are checking into Casper every 15 minutes or so,
Yep.
Is there a process that's running at all the times that if a beacon is nearby, it activates something to check with Casper? Or is it only going to be checking with the Casper every 15 minutes and then saying, is there a beacon nearby?
Yeah, great question. So there's a trigger for policies on beacon state change. So as soon as that device, like, this line in the carpet here, it may be hard to see, but as soon as that device changes and that beacon state changes, that could be used as a trigger for that policy. Yeah. Another question up here, yeah. Josh is coming. If someone over here can ask, then Josh has to run all the way down. Oh, we'll come to you next.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, man.
I was wondering about site surveys. We do site surveys with Wi-Fi network design now, and would the same type of survey be applicable for thinking about iBeacon placement, or do we have any techniques or tips on that?
That is a great question. I do not have any techniques or tips on that. Somebody else have a helpful thing? Yeah, up here? Oh, okay, different question.
I would say that, yeah, it's very similar. The thing that you need to keep in mind is that because it's Bluetooth-based, the range isn't as great. So all the same techniques and things like that that you do for a Wi-Fi survey work, but you got to tweak them because of the shorter range of the technology.
But the same blocking materials would apply.
Exactly.
That's
yep,
right.
exactly.
Yeah. Over here.
Thank you, Josh. I wonder if anyone has done any testing, and maybe you guys or anyone in the group has done any testing on this, where it essentially, as soon as you come into an iBeacon zone or region, pardon me, it locks it down to a specific app. I know there are a lot of K-12 people out here from standardized testing. So could I set an iBeacon up, say in the cafeteria, run all the students in, and as soon as they walk in with the iPad, it's locked to the app that's done for standardized testing?
Anybody done any of that? No. In our testing, it's something obviously theoretically possible. We've done the same idea of a deployable action happening when that falls in. That's exactly the workflow that we're thinking of. The specific, have we done lock to an app and then tested, well, what happens if I'm just on the line or some of that? So what about the student that's on the edge of the perimeter? What would happen there? We haven't gone that far, but that's a great use case and a great example, even if in the library, right? We're doing some testing in the library, you get that stuff, and yeah, it's a great idea.
What version of the JSS was this supported feature?
9.5 and below, yeah. So,
And above.
and above. Below, because, yeah.
I got an order.
Yeah, all the way back to 1. We backported. I shouldn't say that.
No, you're next. I got you, and then I'm gonna come back to you.
I was just wondering if you have two classrooms, do you have any overlap? I like the idea of the students going from one room to the other and the Apple TV being active, but is there going to be overlap between the classrooms, or can you control that at all?
Great question. So the idea of near, far, and immediate is where some of that comes into play, where if I'm right on top of one iBeacon region, I would be closer, or if I'm nearest to this sync cart, that would kind of get some of that same type of idea. So Brad and I were going to do this with someone in the audience, but the idea of this is one state, and then this might be another, and then if I'm right next to Brad, that's going to be a very different one. And so being able to do that in the classroom is exactly where iBeacons comes in, and the power of that, because we're GPS, the other one that I thought was on floors, right? You have 2 buildings, you have the same lat and long, but you're in 2 separate altitudes. And so being able to do that with an iBeacon to say the nearest one is exactly that case where that comes up and is helpful. Yeah.
Just checking to see what sort of business or companies that you've sort of aligned with liked selling iBeacons. I know one of the ones that I've been familiar with is a company called Roximity, and they've got a 5-year battery life on their iBeacons.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so just kind of questioning as to battery or power, what companies you liking.
Yeah, so a couple things we've looked at. One, Two Canoes, who's here and sponsored the JNUC for 2014. They've been really great in doing a lot of stuff with iBeacons and actually doing some integration with us and making not only the setup of those iBeacons, but the definition in the JSS easy. Our criteria when we were looking at different iBeacon vendors for people that make those, the pucks, is it easy to set up? And is it easy to actually procure and get to me, right? And so the other ones that we've looked at are Estimote. If anyone's familiar with Estimote, they look like little rocks. Those are kind of neat. They're around. Contact and Blue Cat are the 3. Contact is Kontaakt. And those are the three that we just used because they had different global presence, right? Different places that they had some sort of representation. So if you're not just in the US, you can get them elsewhere. But then also good APIs and good integration points and that sort of thing so that it's easy. You know, the use case that I thought of is if I buy 1,000 iBeacons, how long is it going to take me to configure and stick on the walls? And how do we bring that down? And so those were 4 great companies that really helped with what we were doing in that space. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So let's say you have a JSS that's not on the DMZ, it's private.
Yep.
You go into a conference room, you have a beacon, so when you walk in, you get a Apple TV, you get a printer or something. So what if the user just closes his laptop, walks out, he's at home, he never checks in? Is the policy still going to remove it, or do we need to make the policy like offline at that point so it removes those profiles?
Offline at that point.
Because it can't check back in.
Right, right. So good question. There's a little difference between the objects themselves. So a configuration profile is different than a policy, right? Where a configuration profile falling out of scope implies losing that configuration, whereas a policy just means it's no longer available to that person. So the implication on the workflow that you may have, where if I have to define a secondary policy for offline to make that available, that would depend on what the different networking stuff is, how far along they got in that, and that sort of thing. My guess is that the policy engine that's already there would just pick up where it left off the next time they got back in, and they just wouldn't have that as completed when they're home. Make sense? Okay. Another question up here. Yeah.
So we're thinking about using iBeacons as sort of a breadcrumb, so that when we have a guest or somebody come in and we give them a device that is ours,
Yep.
that they can pull it up, and if they need to go to a conference room or somebody's office, it kind of guides them there. Is that something that's doable or far-fetched?
No, absolutely doable. I mean, the idea of directions in a museum or that sort of thing is, big stuff that a lot of folks are looking at. The JSS wouldn't necessarily be a part of that process, right? We're not tracking history of a device as far as what beacons has it been near or far from, or I can't look back in the history for, John Miller's iPhone and see, oh, he wasn't at work today, or, whatever that may be. But that sort of technology is absolutely available. Is anyone using some guided breadcrumbing is a good way of thinking about it, but guiding users throughout a building using iBeacons? Not yet. Soon. Jamf Nation, I would post to Jamf Nation. I know that there are people out there that are doing it. Another question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you scoping directly to the iBeacons, or do you have the ability to make smart groups out of the proximity to the iBeacons as well?
So you are your scope is a limitation or an exclusion from the iBeacon itself. So the looking at, when you have your scope, you'll have those tabs. You can go into there. So the off-campus is an exclusion, and the AirPlay Apple TV target is a limitation. Right? All devices that are near this region or in this region get that. Yeah.
If I'm deploying to a cohort of students, anything purchased through VPP, would that be able to be triggered once they enter the classroom, say like for orientation on the first day?
Yep.
All come down to their iPad, have everything that they need there?
Yep. It's a part of scope on purpose, right? For that same thing. We put it into scope, so any of the deployable things that we look at, we'd want to have as a part of that. These are great questions. This is really good.
Who had it?
Oh, okay. It's actually on the other side, Josh.
iBeacon definitions currently are not site aware. Is this something that's on the roadmap?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So the ability to say these are the regions that are in this site, and then it's more around visibility and who knows what regions are where is what we're looking at.
I'm thinking in a large distributed org with lots of site admins, and as the overall admin, I don't want to be bugged constantly by 300 site techs to add iBeacon definitions.
Right. Yeah. Stuff we're looking at. Absolutely.
He's my favorite.
Thank you. Do iBeacons, as far as using radio signals, do they just go omnidirectional as far as just horizontal and vertical, or what's the kind of the path of the signal go?
Yeah, they are omnidirectional. So it's not focused in any particular area, at least not of any of the iBeacons I'm aware of. Just like you can have an access point that focuses a signal in a certain direction, it would be possible to do an iBeacon that way, but I'm not aware of any such thing. As far as I know, they're all omnidirectional.
So I have a question about BYOD. Yes. So you need the self-service app in order on iOS to be able to trigger it. My understanding is BYOD, you don't have the self-service app. Is there a way to do iBeacon triggering of workflows with a BYOD device?
So for the personal device management within the Casper suite, it's an optional self-service deployment for those devices. Self-service is an app that sits on the iOS devices, is required for finding the location. So kind of connecting all the dots there. We're looking at it for the immediate stuff for what we have for personal device management. This type of management isn't a big need on the BYO side, where we're not seeing a lot of users bring in their personal iPhone device to try to AirPlay their stuff. They typically have another piece of technology, a Mac or their iPad that they're using to actually do some of that. It's stuff we're looking at, but it's probably lower on the list than support for Android L and some of that sort of stuff.
Right, so you brought up Android just put. Is Android support for iBeacon currently with the self-service? Is there an app? Is there an Android app for self-service first, and is it Beacon aware?
There is a self-service app for Android. It is not Beacon aware today. I think with the great part about the Apple devices, and one of the things that was exciting for me when they announced it, is they said, hey, here's this thing, it's called iBeacon. Oh, and it's on every piece of hardware that's shipped from us from the last 3 years. And we don't have that same confidence on the Android side. We don't know where it is and where it's not.
Okay, one last thing. You said there was limited to 20 regions. Can you talk a little bit about wildcarding to allow you can actually obviously be in more than 20 regions if you use wildcarding? I don't know if you did mention it on purpose or not, but you can talk to that.
Regions as they're defined within the JSS, map to an iBeacon through its, forgive me, I'm going to get a little technical, through its UUID and its major and its minor value. Those are the things that you see in the JSS screen when you set it up. You could have one region be 100 iBeacons if they all had the same UUID and major and minor value, right? Or you could have one region be 100 iBeacons if the JSS was configured to look for one UUID and asterisk for the major and minor, right? The only time you really run into the region problems is when you get really specific, right? So if you had 21 iBeacons and they each had a different UID and a different major and different minor value, so on and so forth, and you wanted to detect all those, you'd come up one short.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. For what it's worth, we believe that it's first in, last out for the beacons. So if I have my regions, I think best practice is going to be define your overarching major building area, much like you would a network segment that's broader scoped, I guess, your 10.10.1.1 to 10.10.255 to 255, just to cover a bunch of stuff. Have that defined so that if a device falls into anything that's there, it kind of keeps that as one of its regions that's stored in that 20. And technical stuff and kind of how you define that and that sort of thing we can talk through, but that first in, last out, as soon as I leave, that region's the first one to get kind of taken off the stack. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
If I'm going to use iBeacons to monitor the entering and the exiting of a building for any reason, do I need to have 2 beacons, or is that a single beacon that can handle that?
Depends on how big the building is, right? So in a school facility, you might have a bunch of beacons on the outside walls, and each one of those regions can be, I know that the devices that are no longer here would be a part of that major region, major's a part of the asterisk wildcard region that's around that. So it can be as many as you want or as few as one. It doesn't have to be multiples, but again, that's where the facility is covered by one region that is multiple pucks that could be defining of that region.
Yeah, right on. I'd add to that keep in mind that an iBeacon doesn't provide any direction or heading or anything like that. So if you just have one at the entrance to your ginormous facility, you don't know whether you're coming or going when you go past it. You only know that you were near it for a little while.
Yeah. One back there? Yeah.
Ready?
Yeah.
I know initially there isn't any reporting options for the iBeacon, but is there any sort of ad hoc options for you to be able to, for example, in a school, have students check into a class via their iPads coming on through that screen, very much like locking to an app?
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to then utilize the JSS to sort of grab that serial information and just create sort of ad hoc lists about who is touching in with that iBeacon?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the other things that we're looking at with the iBeacon technology that we haven't done in initial rollout, there's the idea of immediate, near, and far, and we're not doing much with that today. That's stored, but if you're any one of those three, you're in it, right? So we don't do much on top of that. The other thing is, what are the other use cases for that? One that I thought of from an education standpoint is, Mr. Benson's class goes out to the wetlands to do, some testing on migratory birds. And so everyone that's near that iPad, which is now an iBeacon, gets that content that he's generated and has stored on his iPad. Very similar idea of being able to use and kind of be the mobility of the iBeacon and use that for that same idea. So right now, we don't have a lot around what those three values are, how we can use that with the other technologies that we have, but that's absolutely the stuff that we're looking at.
And can we just attach iBeacons to people yet?
Yeah,
And
yep.
utilize them as...
You've actually got one on your back already. No, I'm just kidding. No. Yeah, the attaching an iBeacon to a person, as much as that's the joke, the ability to automatically turn someone's iPhone into a beacon to know if I'm now near another person or not, we don't have that. There's still the stuff where that person has to, it's very Apple and very privacy oriented, where that person has to opt into that technology, or opt in and agree that that's okay. But that ability to do that through the different technologies that we have is there, where we can provide the ability to opt in and get some, this now a person is an iBeacon. Jokes aside, that's places that could be. Other questions or thoughts or? Yeah, right up front.
I just kind of had a thought about this is probably going to be more beneficial for providing access to things as opposed to restricting access, since you could avoid this technology by just shutting off your Bluetooth or something like that.
Right.
So it's just a thought.
Yeah, very good point. I think, along those lines, iBeacons is a great thing to think about with providing value, which is, just kind of a content, tools, whatever those users need. Use it as a way to provide things for them based on the context that we now understand, versus restricting to only these things. And those limitations, you need to have Bluetooth enabled, you need to have the app that's looking for that, say that's okay to use the location services. And if the users don't have that, it's no longer a dependable way to lock to only things when you're here. And so kind of knowing what that balance is for your users and providing good resource and tools and content, just like the conversation we're all used to having of making self-service a very valuable tool for the users. Same thing, making this a valuable thing for them will help them be successful in what they're doing. That'll help us as IT admins do what we're doing as well.
Yeah, right on. I'd add to that during the development of the iBeacon functionality, with the development team, our heart was really looking at ways to give users things that would delight them, that would benefit them, give them things that would make their lives easier, as opposed to trying to restrict them and control them and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for listening, participating in the conversation.
And I'd like to thank Josh for running all over the place.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Like I mentioned, post the ideas that you have, the different new things and exciting things that you're thinking about. Keep the discussion going off the, away from keyboard space that we're here today. Jamf Nation's a great place to do that. Let everybody know what exciting things you thought of, and we'll use this technology for great things. So thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thank you.